Hi everyone. I think we're live. Hussam, will you do the intro or should I just go ahead and start?
Hello,
Hussam, I think
everyone.
you're
Thank you
muted.
for
Yeah.
joining us today on this live stream. My name is Hassam, and I lead the reactor for the Middle East and Africa. And today is a continuation of an amazing series where we are talking about the Microsoft Graph Challenge. We are joined by Aisha, Somalezi, and Bob to continue talking about this series. So, yeah, I'm going to hand over the mic and the stage. We're live, so you can ask us questions, and we're responding to the chat. Interact. We'll bring these questions also on the screen. And today's session is recorded as much as all the sessions in this series, so you'll find them on the Reactor YouTube channel. That's pretty much it. Aisha, tell us more about what we're expecting to do today.
Awesome. Thanks, Hussam. Let's get our slides as well on screen. Today is the Ask the Experts office hour session. Obviously, we're expecting your questions and we are here to answer all of your questions about the challenge, about Microsoft Graph. But before we jump into it, we have a little agenda for you as well. We will just introduce ourselves and then go through the challenge overview. If you're new in the challenge, we just want to do a quick recap of what is 30 days of Microsoft Graph Challenge. And then we will jump into Ask the Expert questions. We will start asking our questions to Bob, and I will also carry some of the questions myself. My name is Aicha Bash. I'm a cloud advocate at Microsoft. I'm based in Dubai, and I love working solutions across Microsoft Cloud, including Azure, Microsoft 365, Power Platform, and I love engaging with the community through such events. You can connect me through any social channels, Twitter, LinkedIn, GitHub. I'm all across all these channels, and I love getting to know new developers. I'm also a student ambassador alumni. I was a student ambassador almost 10 years ago, and I work at Microsoft for 6 years now. And let's get Somalese introduce himself. Hi, Somalese.
Thanks, Aisha. Hey everyone, again, you're seeing this very same face that you've been seeing for the past few weeks. My name is Somele Zadigo, and I am a cloud advocate at Microsoft. I'm based out of South Africa. So, again, just like Aisha had mentioned, and everyone else on the chat had mentioned, just make sure that you tell us where you're joining from. I am based in South Africa, so I'm joining from South Africa. I love building solutions using the Power Platform, Teams, and Azure. And of course, with the series that we're actually doing with Microsoft Graph, I've grown to love Microsoft Graph, and I'm trying to integrate Microsoft Graph with my Power Platform solutions. So obviously, I would like to see what everyone else is building throughout this journey that we are doing with you guys. Also, if you want to actually share your learnings, you want to share all of your projects that you are doing, all the cool stuff that you're doing, with me, you can connect with me on social media. That would be Twitter and LinkedIn as well, so that you can be able to share your thoughts and you can share your learnings and you can ask me questions, obviously. And of course, I am so excited to be here today. And I know you are seeing us for the second time in this week. We just want to answer all of the questions that you guys have around Microsoft Graph. And today, it's not just Aisha and me again. We actually have Bob. Bob would actually introduce himself very shortly. So, Bob, take it away.
Thanks so much, and it's great to be here. This is a great series, and I'm so happy to be part of it. I'm a teammate of Ahicha and Somalis, and I actually am based in the United States near Boston, Massachusetts. I've been building solutions on top of Microsoft's collaboration tools for a long time. It started with SharePoint back on the on-premises days, and have kind of watched the entire transformation to the cloud, which has been pretty interesting, and is what kind of led to the Microsoft Graph itself. And I am happy to connect with the community, of course, on Twitter at Bob1German. Also, I didn't mention LinkedIn, but LinkedIn is another good place to grab me. And so thanks for inviting me to join today.
Of course. And Bob, we're actually really lucky to have you in this session today. You've been at Microsoft very long time, right? Yeah. How long you've been working at Microsoft?
Well, it's been a little over 20 years, but I left and
Wow.
came back. So I'm what they call a boomerang. Um, so about, let's see, yeah, it was maybe almost 10 years ago that some friends of mine left Microsoft to start a small consulting company nearby here in the Boston area. And I had a really good time for about 6 years working on this little startup and just helping our clients, finding out kind of what's going on in the other side of the picture. If you're, instead of working for Microsoft, you're a customer of Microsoft or a partner of Microsoft, and that was all a lot of fun. Then they got bought by a big company, and I kind of decided if I'm going to work for a big company, my favorite is Microsoft, so I came back. I was
Cool. And you know all the journey of how Microsoft Graph started in the first place, which is brilliant, actually. And today we will answer all of the questions about Microsoft Graph.
cool. Yeah, I'm a big
Awesome.
fan of the graph for sure.
Yeah, we all are. Okay, so before we jump into the questions, we quickly want to do an intro. So Melissa and I prepared a couple of slides for you if you're just joining this challenge new, if you just heard about it and joining the session. 30 Days of Microsoft Graph is actually the series we are running throughout November. We are in week 3 right now, which is the place where we are connecting the dots and we are learning about what we can do with Microsoft in the custom scenarios. That means that we pass through week 1 and week 2, and we use all of the learning materials to understand what Graph is in the first place. This is the week that you will choose your project to build in the week 4 and week 5. That means that you will actually build something by using Microsoft Graph. And at the end of the challenge, if you submit your project, then we have amazing prizes for you, which includes one-on-one mentorship from Microsoft directors and also includes interviewing your project and yourself, obviously, on Microsoft official YouTube channels. So let's give a little bit more details. So Melissa, we'd like to take us through and hear a couple details how people can register and how they can engage with us in the discussions and so on.
Yes, of course. So if we just quickly switch over to my screen, bear in mind that the link that is on the slides that Aisha just shared a few minutes ago, you can actually use it to come to this landing page that we have on the screen. So this is the landing page that we have for 30 days of Microsoft Graph. So what does this mean for you as much as you are very much new to the challenge itself? Right. We have all of these resources all together just prepared for you so that you can be able to use them and consume them, and you can just get started with working with Microsoft Graph. So I'm just going to scroll a little bit towards the bottom here, and you'll find all of the information around what Microsoft Graph is and the challenge is all about. And on top of that, we have a kick-off section. So this kick-off section is when we actually just covered it in our first few sessions when we started off with our challenge, and you'd find that we have a register to the 30 Days of Microsoft Graph Challenge, in which this is something I'm about to get into. So if you click on this link, this is a link, it will take you to a different tab where you will find a Cloud Skills Challenge that you can be able to join. Now, I just want to say this to you guys. You're new to the 30 Days of Microsoft Graph Challenge. Don't fret, but just know you only have 11 days left to actually complete this. So just make sure that you join the challenge, go through the learning material, understand what Microsoft Graph is, and catch up with the rest of us. So when you join this challenge, obviously you would need to go into your Microsoft Learn profile, sign into it, and then click on join the challenge. And then on top of that, before you can check that that statement that says I have read and agreed to the official rules, Aisha mentioned prizes. So if you want to actually be part of the draw for the prizes that we have for the challenge, you will have to accept the official rules that we have for the challenge, in which it will take you to a Microsoft form where we just need a little bit more of details about about you and who you are. Obviously, just a few nitty-gritty things that we need so that we can be able to enter you into the prize draw. Right after that, if you've submitted all of the information on that Microsoft form, you can check this and then continue. Again, if you don't want to be part of the prize draw, you can just click on continue, be part of the challenge, and then go through the learning modules. Surprisingly, it's a very short challenge. It has a few learn modules, so you'll be able to catch up quickly. Okay, that's enough about how you can be able to register for the challenge itself. So if we head back to our landing page on the GitHub pages, you'd find that there's also onboarding resources. So obviously, when you join a challenge and you start off with a challenge, you would need to understand, do I have prerequisites that I need to complete and all of those things. So if you are part of this challenge and you want to get started, you need to go through the onboarding blog post, in which it actually covers a few things that you would need to complete this challenge. Like, for an example, you would need a developer account for specific things that you're going to be doing within the Graph challenge. And if you're a student, you can sign up for Azure for Students for free, so that you can be able to consume Azure services. Again, as much as I mentioned about students signing up for Azure for Students, if you ask yourself this question, I am a student, why can I be able to continue with the challenge? Yes, it's not a prerequisite for you to activate the Azure for Students if you're not a student. This is actually just for students to be able to consume Azure services. So I hope it's not going to discourage you to carry on with the challenge itself. And then obviously, there is a GitHub student developer pack for students. Again, if you're not a student, it's still fine for you to be able to use your existing GitHub account. And if you do not have a GitHub account, I suggest that you create one, and then you can follow along with the challenge. So you'd have all of the resources available for you and a step-by-step guide on how you can be able to start onboarding yourself onto the challenge. And then when I scroll towards the bottom within this landing page, you'd find resources from the previous weeks. As Aisha had mentioned, we had week 1 and we covered a basic introduction to what Microsoft Graph is and how we can be able to use the learning materials available to you. That was week 2, and now we're trying to connect the dots. Again, if you want to follow along and you want to understand everything about Microsoft Graph, I suggest that you go through the learning materials from week 1, week 2, up until you catch up with the rest of us on week 3. And then obviously, if you're looking forward to what we have in store for you for the upcoming weeks, which is week 4 and 5, you will find the learning materials there. I know a lot of people would like to be the star pupil or the star of the show and actually get ahead of the challenge. So if you want to do that, there are a few learning materials for the upcoming weeks. Then towards the bottom, you'd find the team that is responsible for the 30 days of Microsoft Graph Challenge. But now, you actually want to ask questions and you want to understand what this is about, or you are facing challenges within your journey of the Microsoft Graph Challenge. So if you scroll up a little bit up, right, on the learning page, you'd find on the kickoff, there's actually a link for GitHub discussions. So if you click on that, it will take you to a discussion forum where you'd need to sign in into your GitHub account. Again, if you're a student, you can still use the GitHub discussions. If you're not a student and you have a GitHub account, you can still use your GitHub account and come here and ask all of your questions. We have a tradition within the 30 days of Microsoft Graph in which Aisha and Jaflet have actually tried to scold me to do. So when you're new to the challenge, you need to introduce yourself to everyone else that is part of the challenge. So that is my little homework to you guys. Introduce yourself if you're new to the challenge and have a conversation with everyone else and ask your questions here on the GitHub discussions. Yeah, so you can see there's a lot of discussion that a lot of people have already engaged in. If you want to ask questions from everyone else involved with the Graph Challenge, not just Aisha, Bob, and myself, you will be able to get the necessary help here on the GitHub discussions. So if you scroll towards the bottom and you want to submit your question, so you would need to just scroll towards the bottom, if I'm not mistaken, and then obviously just write the question that you have, or if you see a question that you can provide your expertise. If you're an expert on Microsoft Graph, you can just reply to that specific comment. Basically, that is all that you need to know about. And I'm just going to pass it over to Aisha to just speak a little bit about the prizes that are available, because I know that she actually mentioned prizes. And that's something that always excites me whenever I'm doing a 30 days of challenge. So, Aisha, what prizes do we have for this challenge?
I think this is the first question we will get as the Ask the Expert session. So in terms of the price, we have two different categories. First off, we have top 10 Cloud Skills Challenge winners, which means that if you complete learn paths that we provide you in the week 1 and week 2, then you will get a prize. You will actually get a chance to record a YouTube short in the Microsoft 365 developer YouTube channel with us. And if you submit your project, that means that you came along with us until the end of the challenge. You completed all of the learned materials. And then you submit your project in week 5 with Microsoft Graph. You develop a project and you submit it. Top 4 projects, top 4 winning projects will actually get a 101 mentorship from directors of Microsoft Graph and advocacy team at Microsoft. And also, the top projects will get interviewed in the Microsoft 365 Developer YouTube channel. We will interview you and ask you questions about your project and learn more, because we know that other developers would be interested in about your solution too. And we will get to know you a little better in the official Microsoft channel. So these are the prices. Speaking of the project itself, this week, as I mentioned, is the time to submit your project proposal. If you go to ak.ms/30 days of MS Graph /scenarios, or just scan the QR code, it will be way easier. You will be directed to the GitHub discussions where we shared top Microsoft Graph scenarios. You can either comment below your own scenario if you come up with a scenario by yourself using Microsoft Graph, or if you think that it's too advanced for me, don't worry about it. We have a long list of scenarios for you listed here. You can just choose one of the scenarios here and comment below that, hey, I will just do this scenario or that scenario in the listed graph scenarios. It's also just fine. Just let us know that you're working on it, so we make sure that someone else is not working on the same scenario. And it's totally fine. You can still win as the top project if you choose any of the mentioned in the list, or you can just, as I mentioned, come up with your own scenario and still use Graph and still can win the challenge. Make sure that you submit your proposal today. Even though it's something super basic and you want to build on top of it, let us know what you have in your mind. And if you have any questions, just ask here today. We're live and we can answer your questions about Microsoft Graph and help you with your own scenario too. And finally, as Somaleza mentioned, in general, if you have any questions about Microsoft Graph, about the challenge, you can always go to GitHub discussions and ask the questions over there. It's not just us answering the questions. The entire Microsoft Graph product group is involved and they are checking your questions and trying to help you. Also, the rest of the M365 advocacy is there to help your questions as well. And we are end of week 3. As you see in November 17, we have the project proposal submission, and today we have the live session. We will just go and move to week 4. With the new week, you will be working on your own project and you will be sharing your questions about your project or about the challenge, and we will be always there to help you. All right, so before we jump into doing any presentation, Bob, is there any questions in the chat or Somaleza that we want to answer before jumping into Microsoft Graph era?
Sure. I mean, I think probably several of us could answer this. Maybe we have more than one perspective, but someone asked, what's the prerequisite to learn the graph? Is this for someone who has maybe no programming background? And I think the answer is you can probably do more if you know how to program, but I don't think it's required by any means. You eventually need to understand how requests work over the internet, because it's a so-called RESTful service, which just means that it uses the same methods that are used for a web page, except we're sending data over it. And but there's things like the Graph Toolkit where you can just place, if you know a little bit of HTML, you can just put a lot of great graph data on your page without any further programming. You can also use it in PowerShell or in Power Apps or Power Platform. So I think there's a lot of options that are a little bit technical, but don't really require like coding kind of background. I don't know.
Yeah.
How did I do as a guy who's mainly
Perfect.
a coder myself?
For me, actually, if you get started with week one materials in the curriculum, I know that we are jumping into week 4, but the curriculum is open for everyone. If you're starting today, you can just consume week 1 content. It's all fine. I think Microsoft Graph Learn Paths are also great ways for you to learn JavaScript as well. If you are interested in maybe learning a coding language, but then maybe you're confused which language to go for at first. And I remember my college years, we've been learning .NET and Java and JavaScript in all different lectures. I was super confused at first that which one to go for. And I think regardless of your preference, if you start with week 1 and if you just follow the steps, along with learning what Microsoft Graph is, you will also learn how to consume JavaScript, how to use JavaScript, and how to install Visual Studio Code a little bit more, which will also give you another skill set to add in your tools, and you will definitely get a lot of benefit if you just have an opinion of how to use JavaScript in basic level, and also how to use Microsoft Graph in the projects like Bob mentioned in JavaScript or .NET or PowerShell. So it's not 100% required. All the learn materials are targeting beginners in this curriculum, so you can just jumpstart and try to learn the coding language itself along the way. Samaleza, do you want to add anything else, or?
No, all good.
Okay.
Sounds good. Do we have other questions?
I think there's one question I'm just seeing in the chat as I'm not a student. I'm having very long experience as developer. Can I still use this platform to learn more about Graph and its use cases? It's a question, and I think it's a great question. I will just add my cent, and then Bob, I will just give it to you, and you too as well, Samaleza. First off, Microsoft Graph is different than GraphQL or GraphDB. Microsoft Graph is actually it's the gateway to all the data behind Microsoft 365, meaning Microsoft Graph gives us access to, let's say, Outlook emails, calendar events, or Microsoft Team chats, and to-do items, and so on and so forth. And it helps us create custom scenarios on top of the data we access. And I'm sure Bob can do a better job in describing, but in general, if you're a student and if you don't have a long experience with any sort of development, it's still a good place for you to get started and learn how you can work with data behind Microsoft 365. And you can get started learning Microsoft Graph by just starting in this curriculum. You don't have to have any background knowledge. You will actually build on top of it if you go with week 1, week 2, week 3 Big Four. And you will also realize while you're completing all these resources, you will get access more and more, let's say, blog post documentation, and you will also find yourself in the community, Microsoft 365 developer community, when you're going through this journey. Bob, do you want to
Yeah.
add anything?
Well, yeah, I guess I would just say that there's yes to everything you said, and I think there's there's a couple of big angles I see, which are really about, why would I use the graph, right? One is if my customer or my users are using also Microsoft 365, and I want to access the data that they're using every day and expose that in my application. I'll give you an example. It used to be that every time I would work on a document, say in Microsoft Word or PowerPoint or Excel, I would then go to share the document with my colleagues, either in a chat or maybe in email, something like that. And then I would have to go and find the document again each time. And it's kind of ridiculous because these computers are supposed to be smart. And I have to go tell it, I was editing this document 2 minutes ago, and I have to go find it in the files on my computer again in order to email it to Somalis or Aicha. This is ridiculous. If you maybe noticed, if you're using our platform for the last few years now, the file you were just editing will be right there at the top of the list when you go to select a file. The reason is because Microsoft Graph is there and is able to see across all the products what has each person been working on, and this is just provides such a simple little thing can provide a huge boost in the experience for users. The flip side of it is not having to reinvent the wheel. So suppose you have a product or you're working on some software that has files, wants to handle files. So do you reinvent file handling? Do you figure out how to do an upload and a download and put it into a blob storage? And then how do you implement search, full text search of that document? And then what about the security of the document? How do you put security and access control in the document? How do you put retention schedules and allow for e-discovery and other compliance scenarios? How do you render the documents in a web browser as well as in a native? I mean, the list goes on and on. How do you handle versioning? Or you could just use the graph and put the document into OneDrive or SharePoint, which are already part of Microsoft 365, and avoid reinventing that, right? Maybe you want a chat feature in your app. Maybe you don't want to reinvent chat. There's anything that Microsoft 365 does is potentially something that you can do in your app without having to kind of start all over again and reduplicate what probably hundreds of people in Microsoft have worked on for years. And you can now leverage all of that in your apps.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a lot of stuff you can automate as well, right, Bob? For example, that you prepare a documentation using Excel or Docs, but every time you don't want to keep sharing the same stuff. Whenever you create a new file in a folder, which will automatically be shared on a Teams chat, you can totally do that by using Microsoft Graph API. And Microsoft Graph API has access to more than 200 data sets. Data sets meaning that data set of Teams, data set of Outlook, calendar, planner, to-do, and all sort of Microsoft 365 apps you can think of, which is incredible. It gives you a lot of space to do automation, also bring this data into your own app. That created lots of space in the past, and Bob was also working on that space for a long time. That means there are a lot of companies are working with Microsoft Graph. That means Microsoft Graph skill is actually very crucial if you're looking for jobs, if you're early in career, or if you're a student. With knowing Microsoft 365 ecosystem and Graph, you can actually create opportunities, internship or job opportunities for yourself. Right, Bob? You should definitely know more than me.
No, I agree completely. I think it's very important in the enterprise space for sure.
Yeah. There is one more question saying, I'm busy learning Python. Will that help, or a new programming language at all? Would you like to share the SDKs, Bob? Maybe telling what sort of SDKs we have available for Microsoft Graph?
Yeah, sure. I believe we have Python. I am
We do.
looking it up. Yeah, I was going to say I don't remember all of them. I look at the ones that I use frequently. Actually, I want to learn Python, so maybe I should team up with this person. Uh, it's a cool language, and my niece is learning it, and I'm really excited that she's getting into computing, and it's definitely the hot language right now. So yeah, so we first of all, you could use any language anything that can do a web call. So if you have a language that can call and make an HTTP request, then that's all you need. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. We do have language SDKs, which means something that lives in a library that you run locally inside your app that makes it easier to call the graph. And I just pulled up a list: C#, PowerShell, TypeScript, JavaScript, Java, Go, PHP, and Python. And it looks like Python is still in preview, but that doesn't mean you can't use it and at least start playing around with it. These SDKs do a number of things for you. They make the authentication a little bit easier. They also, not completely easy, but easier. They also handle things like throttling and other rules of the road. So it's kind of a weird topic, but any API on the internet has to have some defense against denial of service attacks or just being overwhelmed with requests. And so the graph is no exception. And if it gets too many requests in too short of a period of time, it will send back a request or a response that says, come back in a few hundred milliseconds or something. It'll give you a delay, and that you have to wait for a few seconds. And you don't have to handle that. If you do the SDK, it will do that for you, right? And it will follow all the correct rules. And so it's just easier and nicer, I think, to use these SDKs. So absolutely, Python, go for it.
I agree. And Graph API is no different than any other API. I don't know if you were asked to do this stuff at school anymore, but in my time, we were asked to use a lot of weather APIs or I don't know, these APIs that we have to use in our own apps when we were building apps at school. And consuming Graph API is exactly the same. And data you're getting is actually the chat data from Teams and maybe tasks data from To-Do, emails from Outlook. And you can do all sort of get, post, and usual stuff you can do in the different APIs. It's actually, if you ever work with a basic API, you will have to know what to do with Graph. And it's not a complex thing, actually, and you can use with any language, HTTP version, or you can use SDKs to make lives a little bit easier than usual. And I saw Ellen Lawrence said in the chat that we are all students. I can't agree more. I keep learning new stuff about different technologies and from colleagues as well. I've been hearing, for example, which is a new area, and I know Somalese was working on that area. Pretty cool. We've been all discovering what's new and what can help us finding jobs in our business. I think that's what's critical. We have one more question. What are the advantages of using Microsoft Graph instead of using, for example, different PowerShell modules for each Microsoft 365 app? Do you have an answer for that, Bob?
I hadn't really thought about it too much. I think, obviously, if the Graph PowerShell can do it, you're only authenticating once, you're only connecting once, you're not juggling multiple modules. So I would think that would be definitely an advantage. But I think in some cases it doesn't matter as much. I don't know. Any other opinions? What do you think, Aicha?
I think Graph gives you a bit more space than sticking up into a platform or to a let's say one single API or one single language. You can easily switch, change the data set you want to call. Let's say you start with the profile information. You can also start gathering different sort of data sets. You can start calling graph in JavaScript and then you can switch to a Python. I think it's when it comes to Microsoft Graph, everything is around person and the group experience instead of the platform experience.
That's a good point.
I think that can be a really big value because it's at the end of the day, you can access your data with Microsoft Graph API in any sort of platform you want, and there's no limitation to it. I don't have too much experience about PowerShell modules. Maybe I'm not best person to answer it, but I will definitely check more what can be the biggest difference. For me, I think Microsoft Graph API is giving the flexibility and focusing more into the user and the overall group data. It's more into the data than the platform coverage. So I think that's the biggest offer for my point of view. By the way, when we are going through what graph is and so on, Bob, I know that you prepared a couple of slides. Maybe it makes it helps a little bit for some of the participants if we go through what Microsoft Graph is solving along the way, if you just use these slides to showcase.
Sure. In fact, it will even reflect a little bit on this PowerShell question, I think, because really we're talking about kind of the evolution. So I wanted, if any of you are wondering if the Microsoft Graph is real, I wanted to let you know I've met him personally. So this was at the local developer days before the pandemic when we were all able, to meet together, and I guess we can now again. But anyway, it's just fun that I get to meet the graph, the giraffe. So let's see here. Let me get rid of this picture. So yeah, I think part of it is, and if you look at even the way that the PowerShell, I'm going to speak in generalities here, but the way the PowerShell and everything else has evolved, I think that it's underlying all of this has been a bigger move from on-premises to the cloud. And Microsoft 365 is kind of unique in compared with a lot of other collaboration platforms in that we started on premises, so it's been around for a long time, and I think that has some big advantages in that there's a lot of users who know how to use it. If there are companies that are maybe not wanting to completely go into the cloud for whatever reason, they can actually run a hybrid of on-premises and cloud. I think that this is the only big platform that exists, as far as I know, that allows that kind of flexibility. But of course, then there's also, I guess the graph came out of this evolution from on-prem to the cloud. So this is a very high-level architecture, but still I think there's some interesting computer science and distributed systems thoughts that come along with this. So if you think about if you went back 10 years at least, you would find that a lot of these same products existed on premises. So you had Word, Excel, PowerPoint, OneNote, Outlook were the Office suite, and then you had three big servers on the back end: SharePoint, Exchange, and Lync, which became Skype for Business, which sort of became Teams for real-time collaboration. And, IT departments they spent a lot of time deploying these things and keeping them all up to date, because every customer had to do that on their own. If there was a patch for SharePoint, they had to deal with, how do we apply the patch? How do we test the patch? How do we make sure that we don't interrupt the user? All that stuff is now, kind of for Microsoft to deal with that pain on your behalf. But anyway, the way that this worked was that you would have everybody would have on their computer all of those client programs. And whenever a client program wanted to connect to a server, it would just connect. So it was pretty simple. And the way, from a scalability point of view, if you had C clients and S services, you would have C times S connections in the overall system. So if you have, a few thousand users and 3 servers or 3 farms of servers with load balancers, that's okay. It's not so bad, right? So then we moved into the cloud, and what happened? Well, all of a sudden, there are a lot more clients and a lot more servers, right? Because first of all, our mobile clients light up. We start to be able to have guest users come in from other organizations and collaborate with us. There are more programs, there are more applications, and on the back end, there are more applications. Some of the apps are starting to move internally towards a microservices architecture, which is where you have the back end services getting broken into smaller pieces that can be upgraded independently and managed independently. And so C times S connection starts to look pretty busy with a lot of points of failure. And so the graph, this is one of the rare cases to me in computer science where adding another layer helps and speeds things up. A lot of times we add a layer and it's there for the convenience of the programmers. And I always feel like we're kind of gypping our customers when we do that. Hey, we've got this great, extra layer that we can add, and now everybody needs to get a faster CPU, but I saved a day of work, oh boy, isn't that great? So forget that. The graph is actually helping users because it's a consolidation layer. And if you look at the diagram, you can see that instead of C times S connections, we now have C plus S, which as the numbers grow becomes a huge, huge benefit. If you think about it, each of the clients only now has to do one DNS lookup and one authentication to access the entire suite. Whereas before they had to look up the server address and do the authentication over and over again for each of the backend services that they wanted to use. The servers also are dealing with fewer connections. And in addition, they were able to add more consistency to the APIs because these products and the ones that followed are all different. So, and they all came about during different times. Some of them used XML, for instance, instead of JSON, etc. And the graph makes all of those things much more consistent. They also can do things like support the me keyword, which is, the way of just saying whoever's logged in, put their user ID here in the request. And that just simplifies everything and would be harder for these individual products to do. And it can also handle caching, geolocation. Maybe there's an instance of a server closer to you physically. Every server and every client doesn't have to think about that, right? The graph just handles it. And then logging and tracing can be done centrally. And one of the things that I think is really cool, which I mentioned earlier, is tracking the relationships across these different services so that if you were just editing a file in using Word with OneDrive as maybe the back end, and now you're in Teams and you're going to share a file, Graph is that common denominator there that can say that your application in Teams, for instance, could say, what files was this user recently editing? And present the most recent files right at the top. So a ton of advantages. And so I guess I just thought it would be fun to point out some of these architectural benefits of the graph. And from an evolution point of view, I think there's also kind of a practical aspect to it. So the way that this works internally, and I'm not in the graph engineering team, so I'm speaking in high level, but there's still engineering teams for SharePoint and Exchange Online and all these different products underneath. What happens is that they all provide a service layer to the graph. So they still have their native APIs that they originally had. The newer ones have an internal only API because anything new like Planner, for instance, we only publish the graph API because it's newer. And then, so say the SharePoint group creates an adapter or a service layer that plugs into the graph substrate and then calls the native APIs for you and does all that translation for you. So there's a bit of an evolution that I've noticed happening, which is a product comes along and initially it takes them a little while to publish the API. Why? Because they have to coordinate with the graph team and they have to build that service layer, right? And then things like PowerShell come after that, right? So a lot of times a product will come out and they'll immediately have a PowerShell module. And this is more true, I think, of the older products, that they needed to get to the cloud very quickly when the world started sort of shifting towards the cloud. And so you had things like that MS Online, PowerShell module. And then eventually they expose their API in the graph, and then the PowerShell module comes along in the graph and it becomes more unified. And so, it's kind of, there's kind of a delay sometimes between the native API and the graph API. But the graph API has all these advantages and it's totally worth it if you can, take advantage of that.
I agree.
I have a little demo if we have time.
Let's go for it. Yeah, I think we have time. That would be great to inspire with some scenarios, inspire the participants with some scenarios, because this week will be the week they will think about their own project scenarios for next week.
Yeah, cool. So I've got a couple of them. We'll see how much time we have. This first one is, so these are actually Learn modules that never made it, to be honest with you. And I'm hoping to still finish them. There's a whole process to getting Learn modules published, and literally I got halfway through the review process and another project came along and took my attention. So I'm hoping to get these published, but they've been sitting around on the back burner for a while. This one shows how those insights work between different applications. So I chose files here, but I could have just as easily chosen people or other kinds of resources inside of Microsoft 365. And so there's 3 kinds of insights: recently used, shared with, and trending. So, and if the way this is written is if I don't put a user, it's just going to say /me. So if I say /me, I get back a list of my recently used files. If I want to see things that have been shared with me, so maybe Aicha shared a document with me, right? I can click this and I get back that list. And then finally, trending is more of it's less defined. It's more of a fuzzy, that's the word I'm looking for, more of a fuzzy association, that these are documents that me and the people around me have been using, not just necessarily myself. And so these are documents that are likely to be relevant for me, or even for people who are looking at my profile or something like that. Now, suppose that what I really want to do is get this same information for another user. So I just plugged in the user for Katie Jordan, who is a fake user. And she actually has the same trending files. And this is because I'm in my developer tenant and the traffic is very unrealistic, but I can see certainly she has a completely different set of recently used files. And then what's kind of interesting is if I want to see what files people have shared with Katie, the answer is no, you can't do that. We don't allow it. It's just too personal, really.
So we actually need that person's consent, right? In this point, if we want to get data, that person needs to authenticate to access the data, right, Bob?
Yeah, and only Katie can get her own data on what was shared with her. Even these other files, though, these ones that Katie recently used, are also security trimmed. So if maybe the most used by Katie was a document called Things Bob Shouldn't See, .doc, right? And so she's secured it so that I can't see it. It's not going to be on my list if I'm running the API. See, I'm still logged in as Bob, right? Yeah. So I'm asking on behalf of another user, and that might be useful in some scenarios. It's just that we have to also secure it. So Graph is automatically going to trim away anything that I'm not allowed to see. And if we take a look at the code, this is pretty simple call. So it's /users. It's either /me or /users and then the username. And then I'm using here the JavaScript SDK. So this If you're not familiar with it, this is taking, it's basically just making an HTTP request, but it's making the code a little easier by assembling the URL for me and allowing me to use things like filter and top. So I'm only going to get the reason I only saw 5 was because I said 5 here, right? And it handles some of the other details behind the scenes. And then what I get back is this little structure full of, with the top insights. But this shows another cool thing that you can do with the graph, which is I get back the insights. So I get back what's called the resource reference ID, which is actually the path into the graph to get to that file. So this would, if you looked at one of these, it would be, for a file, it'd be something like /drives/ blah, 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 blah of the file. Well, nobody wants to see that. What do they want to see? They want to see the name of the file, the last modified. They want to link to the file, things that are a little bit friendlier. So actually that's a different API. So now I have 5 of these things. I don't really want to do 5 calls because every one of those calls is a round trip into the graph over the internet, and it's going to take some latency time. So I'm actually using, and this is where the SDK becomes worth its weight in gold, which is a weird thing to say about something that doesn't actually weigh anything, but whatever. It's worth a lot because I'm actually able to batch 5 different requests here. So I'm actually going in and taking that resource reference, which is basically the graph call path, and I'm putting all 5 of them into one post request so that I can send that to the graph, get back all 5 responses, and correlate the responses so that I can show this kind of data on the screen.
So batch request does multiple requests in one single post.
That's right. Yeah.
Perfect.
So really, really useful and a great way to speed things up if you're doing more than one request.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And if you're actually building end-to-end scenario, you will highly likely need more than one single graph request, because you'll need a profile picture, you'll need different information, profile information, and the email information, and calendar information. So more than one single graph API. So batch request is actually a really great solution to have multiple API requests at once.
It is. And I mean, this is the way, I don't know how you all work or I haven't followed all of I've seen some of what you've done here in 30 days, but not all of it. But for what it's worth, this is the way I work with the graph. I start with Graph Explorer, which I believe, we've already discussed quite a bit probably. And I just figure out, what do I want and where am I starting from? And I basically make a roadmap, and usually like literally on a piece of scratch paper on my desk. I'm saying, okay, I'm going to do this call, and then maybe I have a OneNote open because I'm pasting in the paths and the requests from the Graph Explorer as I'm going. So maybe the first thing I have to do is figure out who's the user, and then I want to get her, her photo and her title and a few other things. And then I want to take one of those things and get something. Maybe now I want to get her recent files. Well, it's a different request, right? So it ends up being kind of like a road trip where you're saying, well, first we have to go here, and then we're going to go there, and then we're going to go there. Whenever you see a parallel path in that road trip, like we've got to do these 3 things, and they're all depending on this one thing. They don't depend on each other in a stream, right? But I've got the data now to make 3 calls or 5 calls or 10 calls. Then the batch is your friend, because it's going to make it go that many times faster.
Yeah, and I can't agree more. I still start, whenever I need to work with Graph, I start from Graph Explorer, because all the resources are available there, and I can experiment a little bit what kind of data I will get when I make the request. And in this series, the first learning material will show you what Graph Explorer is, how you can get into it, and how to use Graph Explorer in the first place. And then if you came along with us throughout this challenge, I'm sure you already know the Graph Explorer and using Graph API and copying, pasting from Graph Explorer to the code itself. They're all available in our curriculum.
Exactly. That's great.
Bob, I think we have 4 minutes left, but I just want to cover one more thing because I know that you've been doing all this amazing work in the Microsoft Teams apps area too.
Yeah.
Graph also plays a really significant role when it comes to building apps for Teams, right? I just want to give, a couple of opinions to our audience that the Teams apps also work with Graph because it's a natural combination, because it's the data behind it at the end of the day we are accessing with Graph. And Teams is a surface for us to bring the apps into the life. Would you like to share some of the scenarios or maybe
Yeah,
your
absolutely. In
opinion
fact,
about
I
it?
even have another demo for that. But because here's the thing, right? Teams is, if you think about, if you're trying to figure out what APIs are there for a product, just think, did this product start in the cloud or did this product start on-prem? If it started on-prem, there may be a native API, which we're probably trying to phase out. Teams came after the cloud. It's a cloud-only product. So the only API for Teams is the graph. So suppose your app is running inside of a team, and what you want to do is get a list of the people in the team. That's pretty simple, right? Isn't that something anybody would naturally want to do? Well, here's an example, right? I've got a team of people who are doing a lot of field service visits. And so I come into my app, and what it does is it shows me everybody's schedule who is in my team. So how did I get a list of the people in the team? I had to use the graph. It's the only way to do it. Teams does not provide a specific API just for doing this. It actually, is actually using the graph. So every Teams developer ends up using the graph. And then in this case, I can see everybody's appointments. And then just, for fun, this is going to show just kind of a concept, right? Katie is going to be visiting the Lazy K company later today. And I can see that, I've got business data here. So, the payments and things. And I'm also showing the documents that are associated with that client, which was done by tagging them in SharePoint, the photos that we took, and as well as information from the application itself about the customer, a Bing map, and other things. Suppose I want to send a message into Teams. So I'll just say hello 30 days graph and send that in. And again, this is using the Graph API to post a message to the current channel right here, and to provide a deep link back into the app, back into this scenario. So just saying, you kind of always use Graph. Yeah, almost. I mean, unless you're building something that is completely disconnected, right? I guess you could build a game where people play against each other without it, but anything meaningful where you want to kind of get access to who the users are and what they're doing, Graph is the way to do it.
Yeah, exactly. It's the point where we connect with collaboration and productivity scenarios. And obviously, Graph ties in, and Teams is the surface for collaboration for us all. And we actually built a lot of collaboration scenarios using Graph in the Microsoft Teams platform. I think we're out of time, but thank you so much, Bob. And
thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for helping us, Somalize, on updating us on the challenge and letting us know how to get started with it. I also don't want to skip saying that thank you, Paul Umaru. Probably you didn't see, but Paul was helping us in the background, bringing us all of your questions. And thank you so much for supporting us in this session as well. And Somalize, would you like to walk us through finally what sessions left in the 30 days?
Yeah, definitely, Aisha. So after this session, we actually have a few more sessions that we actually need to cover. Obviously, I know Aisha has already spoken about you guys submitting your projects onto the GitHub discussions as well. So you need to obviously join us for the upcoming sessions. We have another one that's actually coming up on the 21st of November, in which we kickstarting week 4 of the 30 days of the Microsoft Graph Challenge, where you actually understand what Microsoft Graph can do, and you look at the real world scenarios for your application. So we will be covering all of those real world scenarios, and obviously, if you have your own scenario that you think you can apply Microsoft Graph into, you can then obviously share it with us, and you can build a solution around that and submit it as a project. And also, I think later that week, if I'm not mistaken, we have another Ask the Experts office hour. So again, if you have any questions that are related to Microsoft Graph and that are related to the learning material that we covered for the next week, then you can come onto the session and actually ask us questions and have an interactive session with us, just like how you did today. And then obviously the last few sessions, that is where the actual work comes in. You guys are working on your own solution and you are submitting it to us. Of course, I just want to remind you, the reason why you're submitting those projects is because of those prizes that we actually spoke about earlier on. And I love prizes whenever I'm doing a challenge. So just make sure that you submit your project to us. And I would really love to see what you guys come up with using Microsoft Graph. And I'm sure Aisha and the rest of the team would love to see what you guys come up with it. And obviously, you can win some prizes along the way. Think about it this way: you're learning while having an opportunity to win a prize. That's a win win situation for me, wouldn't you say, Aisha?
I totally agree. Yes.
Love it.
Awesome. So thanks so much, Melissa, for wrapping up the session and telling us what's coming up next week. And I want to thank you all for speaking in this session and also asking your questions. Thank you so much, keeping the chat active. And we will all meet you again on Monday in Graph Can Do What Real Life World Scenarios. And we will share more scenarios with you on Monday, 21st of November. Thank you all for joining. Have a great weekend. Bye.
Thanks.